Hey, how's it going, guys? My name is Anthony Arevalo. Today we're going to be getting into the second phase of the comic experience, which we tend to call the rough draft. Throughout this phase, we're going to be getting into a little bit of movement and including that within the creation of the comic. I'm going to walk you through essentially in a step-by-step process in regards to how to complete the rough draft. And I'll give you some really good pointers and tidbits as to different maybe places where you might stumble a little bit or where your students are going to have pitfalls or the obvious ones that are going to come. So hopefully we'll take care of all of that throughout this process. Thanks a lot, guys. Hi, we're back again here and we're taking a look now at what's called an exquisite story. Throughout an exquisite story, what's going to happen is your students are actually going to be creating a story together as somewhat of a team. So for example, if your students are seated in a row, you might have them answer a question, then pass their paper on to the person sitting beside them. If they're sitting in a pod or some type of group, a very similar setup, you would have them answer a question, then pass the paper on. So these are essentially the questions that you're going to be asking. When, where, who, what, how, why, and at the very, very end, you're going to have a student actually create a title for this. It's somewhat of a strange idea because your students are working together, they're going to be creating really random ideas, and then at the very end, you're going to have the last person who gets the paper actually put all of these random ideas into some type of a story. And after they create the story, then they would create the title for it. So basically just a real quick idea for you. The very first thing you would do is hand out a sheet of paper to your class. Right after that, you would say, hey guys, we're going to get into what's called an exquisite story. There are a few questions that I'll be asking you. Your job is to answer it in a one-question answer. So, here goes. I would start off by having my students answer the question as to when their story occurred. Something that might happen is you might get some kind of a date. An example, you might get some kind of a time. So for our story here, the sake of it, I'll say it, the when would be 1984. After that, you would move on to the very next question, which would be where. And I'll make up something funny here. I'll say in the jungle. From the jungle, the next question you would ask is who. Essentially getting into who the story is about or who the main character is. So here I'll use my who as Bob. From there you want to move into the very next question, which is essentially what. So for my what, I'll say we want to think of a verb here. Found a rock. Then we want to answer the question, how? How did he find the rock? He found a rock by digging and he was digging. Why was he digging? Because he dropped his tooth. So he dropped his tooth. Basically, as you're going through each of these questions, you're going to move on from one student to the next. And as you're doing it, the very first piece of paper would look something like this with the when. After you ask them the first question, they fold the paper back. After having answered it, they pass the paper on. So now the next person is looking at a completely blank piece of paper here. You would ask them the next question as to where. In a one-word response, they would answer where it could have happened. After that, they would again fold it back. And you would have a clean slate again. They'd pass it on, and the next person would answer the question, who? After answering it, they would fold it back. So you're basically going to go through this entire process with the paper, and at the very end, the last person would have it. Their job would be to unfold the paper, open it up, and essentially from there, they're going to take all these random ideas and put them into a really short story. It's always something that's really humorous. You'll get some really strange ideas and strange stories. The ultimate goal here is to get your students into the idea of writing a story. Here we're starting off with something that's really short and really simple. Basically anyone can do this. From there, the very next thing, they're focusing on higher order thinking skills here. The reason why, they're taking all of these random ideas here and they're putting them together. They're meshing all of these random things, putting them together. And we know that when students are creating that style of a connection, that it's really emphasizing both the right hemisphere of the brain as well as the left hemisphere of the brain, because of the creativity behind it, of course, and the logical thinking that's entailed with how that goes. And that's essentially the exquisite story. Hi and welcome back. The very next thing we're going to be moving on to is a Simon Says game. I use this strategy in my class on a daily basis. Before I started using this strategy in class, it was the typical stuff. Hey class, everybody open up your books. You're going to flip over to the glossary. You want to write the word, the definition, the part of speech. Don't get me wrong, I still do that, but I also follow that up with this game. It's a really fun game. Basically, I'm using Simon Says in order to teach or maybe front load key vocabulary that I need my students to really understand. Before using this strategy, classroom average on a vocab test was about an 80%. After using this strategy, I found that they really enjoy it, and during vocab tests, I'll actually see them creating the gestures as they're running through some of the different words. But I found that scores really began to increase, and I was looking at about an average of about a 95. Most students were getting 100% on these tests. So here's what the game's like. I'd basically say, Simon says, hands in there. Simon says, hands on your shoulders. Simon says, hands on your hips. Simon says, hands behind your back. And as soon as they put their hands behind their back, what I do at this point is I say, here's the gesture for dialogue, like your characters are speaking, or they're talking to each other, or they're having a conversation. Then I'd say, hands in there, and I'd kind of trick a few of them there. Simon says, hands on your hips. Simon says, show me the sign for dialogue, and right away they'd be doing this. Then again, I'd move on to the very next term. Simon says, hands in the air. Simon says, hands on your hips. Simon says, hands on your shoulders. Simon says, show me the sign for 1 point perspective. I would leave them hanging here because they're going to be wanting to figure out, oh, what's 1 point perspective? And then right away, I would do this. 1 point perspective is where everything in the panel is leading to one specific spot. Your lines, they're all going to one space. Awesome idea here would be, think of a highway. When you're looking at it from afar, you tend to see how it's all going into one vanishing point. That's 1 point perspective. Simon says, hands on your hips. Simon says, hands on your shoulders. Simon says, hands in there. Simon says, hands on your hips. Simon says, hands on your knees. Simon says, hands behind your back. And at this point I would say, here's the gesture for characters. I might just show something really easy, like your characters are your main people, they're the people who are walking around. Simon says, show me the sign for characters. My students would start to do this stuff. Simon says, hands in there. Simon says, hands on your hips. Simon says, hands on your shoulders. Simon says, wiggle your fingers. Simon says, wiggle high. Simon says, wiggle low. Simon says, show me the sign for dialogue. Simon says, show me the sign for 1 point perspective. Simon says, show me the sign for characters. They're the people who are walking around. Simon says, hands behind your back. At this point, I'd move on and say, your very next term is going to be word art. So I'd say, here is your gesture for word art. And I would spell out the word POW so that they could all see it. Then I might say something like, Simon says, 2 hands in there. Simon says, 2 hands in there and wiggle your fingers. Simon says, 2 hands low. Simon says, 2 hands low and wiggle your fingers. Simon says, hands on your hips, hands in there, just to kind of fake them out again. Simon says, hands on your hips. Simon says, hands on your shoulders. Simon says, show me the sign for 1 point perspective. Simon says, show me the sign for word art. And remember, they would want to spell the word out. Simon says, show me the sign for characters again. So at this point in time, I'm just reviewing these. That's the whole goal. And finally, the very last one, something like Simon says, hands behind your back. While their hands are behind their back, I'm moving on and I'm teaching another word. I would say, Simon says, show me the sign for onomatopoeia. My favorite sign here would be the one for boom. So I might not have them say the word boom, but only show the gesture like this, and maybe lip it. So it would be. Simon says, two hands in the air. Simon says, hands on your hips. Simon says, hands on your shoulders. Simon says, show me the sign for dialogue. Simon says, show me the sign for 1 point perspective. Simon says, show me the sign for characters. Simon says, show me the sign for word art. And they would all be spelling the word. Simon says, show me the sign for onomatopoeia. And that's basically, Simon Says, a few tidbits for you real quickly. First day, introduce them to all of the vocabulary. Make it fun. Play the game Simon Says. Maybe focus on 1 or 2 words. Second day, you focus on 2 words already. You want to introduce the rest of the words. Third day, you've already introduced the words. Students already know it. Play the game Simon Says, and don't model the gestures. Only say the words, so the game would look like this. Simon says, hands in the air. Simon says, hands on your hips. Simon says, hands on your shoulders. Simon says, show me the sign for dialogue. And I'm not showing them. That's the important part, because you want them to think of it. And they're going to look around the classroom and they're going to say, oh, hey, I saw that person show the sign. I'm going to copy them. And that's basically what the Simon Says game is all about. Thanks a lot, guys. Thanks for tuning in, guys. We've been going for about 15 minutes right now. We're going to take a really short break, and then we'll be right back with the second portion of the video. Thanks again.